All right. So, um, we're going to talk about decisions you need to make before you think about Kubernetes, before you even start doing the first application deployment there. And uh, why is that? Why you should care about this and listening what we have to say. So the thing is, for the last year, even more, I've been working on the team who do Kubernetes deployments in Octopus. So our goal is to make it as smooth as possible, as good as possible, and the experience should be, well, not overwhelming, which it could be with Kubernetes. And we heard so many stories from big companies, from small companies, from companies deploying 300 services to 300 clusters, and companies deploying just a couple of apps with just one small team. And after a while, we realized that, hey, there are some similarities. Doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter how big a deployment is, you will have same issues, you will maybe have same group of questions. And it would be so much easier sometimes if you could just consider that in advance. So we put it all together in this slide deck, and just in a conversation mode with John, we just go for that and say, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Maybe you should think about this thing first, right? And then, well, some of this you probably know about, some of this maybe you don't. Let us know what you think and let us know what we missed, right? So, should we jump straight into that, John?
Yeah, let's get started. That's awesome.
Cool. So, what we will cover today. So, we start with what Kubernetes has to do with business, right? Looks like it's just a platform, but it's not that simple. So, your business actually dictate how you should think about where you're deploying and if you can and should do that, right? So, we talk about some choices originated from your business structure. And then we talk about architecture, very high level. So, how should it look like at scale? Then we talk about operations. So, who will actually work with the clusters and deployments? Then we talk about very simple at the first glance, but the topic which can lead you in deep weeds. This is like how you store your configuration. And then what's important about deployment tool. And in the very end, we really shortly touch on like what Octopus has to do with all that, right? What we do, what we cannot do, because Kubernetes is way bigger than just deployment tool. All right, but the first thing first, and I feel like we must bring this question to the table. We love Kubernetes, but have you actually considered if you need Kubernetes, right? Is it the only tool to deploy containers? Is it the only tool to run your platform? So before you just do all in Kubernetes, I think you really should consider alternatives. You should think about, okay, what I want from Kubernetes. Why is it Kubernetes? Um, do I have access to the expertise? Will I be able to find a partner or hire a person who will know what they're doing with that? Will I be able to grow in a year or two? What if I need to grow my infrastructure twice or like three times? What will happen then? And yeah, there are a lot of great things about Kubernetes, and maybe you will leverage this power, but I think you just need to ask the question first. What do you reckon, John? Have you seen
Yeah, I
examples where
think
you kind of don't need Kubernetes?
I think so. I think the thing about Kubernetes is that it's pretty big and complex, and so there's lots of knobs and dials to turn, so to speak. But I think a lot of people are drawn to the fact that it gives you a scalability and also allows you it provides a lot of the automated management capabilities around being able to scale quite easily. However, that does take you kicking and screaming in that direction. By enforcing the fact that you have to utilize containers. So when people are thinking about, Kubernetes and how, pods are just instantiated and away you go, that all sounds great until you realize that, hey, containerized application deployments and application development that leverage containers is a bit of a different animal. So you have to consider some of those things prior to making the switch. In addition to that, I mean, I don't think everyone needs planet scale, right? Like that's part of the design decisions that Google made when they were building Kubernetes a long time ago was that they were building this thing in order for them to scale to massive amounts of traffic. And yes, I concede the fact that your application may be the best thing ever and it's awesome, but does it really need to serve billions and billions of requests? Is there going to be a big price to pay? Not in terms of just because it's all about cost, basically. You're going to have to pay a little bit of upfront costs there learning about the tool. It's not easy. You're going to have to pay an upfront cost there in terms of your development strategies, etc. So those are definitely considerations to make prior to making the switch.
Yeah, these are very good points. Good news is Kubernetes is getting a little bit easier with a lot of providers doing Kubernetes, managed Kubernetes from the cloud. But we'll talk about these choices and we'll talk about when you actually need Kubernetes. And maybe it's the best and only choice sometimes. Okay, so let's start with your business. And the first question I believe you should ask is, do you know your requirements and limitations? Not the platform requirements, but your requirements. Like, hey, do you use cloud? Can you actually use cloud? Do you have some data? Do you have local regulation which won't allow you to use cloud? Do you have some kind of a legacy? Maybe you're a big bank and you have, I don't know, DB2 developed 30 years ago and it doesn't really work in every cloud if you think about this. Do you have many regions? Are you going to work in 50 different countries and each country require you to store data locally? Is it still, is it a barrier for you? Do you want to have many tenants? Like maybe you have amazing B2C app and all the clients will just work in one instance of that. But what if you have a big B2B customers? What each customer wants their own private space and you need to now create like hundreds and hundreds of this. Can you scale? Do you need to scale? Do you have something like a tax period that every quarter or every year you have to scale like 10 or 100 times and then it goes down? Do you have unpredictable performance issues? So anything like that? What's your CLA, SLA? Do you have to be always available? Can you afford some maintenance windows? So what else, John? What else did I miss?
I think what you're getting at here is there's a lot of things to consider outside of the application itself. I think as developers, we typically fixate on solving the problem first, and then we'll leverage Kubernetes because it gives us scale and not thinking about all of the other aspects that go around with this. Obviously, we're trying to make the case here, or you can see we're trying to make the case for using a deployment tool like Octopus because it does help solve some of these challenges. But the requirements and limitations that you list here certainly go into helping in terms of the lifespan of the application itself. It's going to live many, many years, presumably, and it's going to have lots and lots of moving parts and pieces. Kubernetes is going to impose upon you some requirements that you may not consider. And so those are things that you need to make sure that you're careful considering when building out your apps.
That's true, and that will definitely inform your choice about the platform. So if you want and can use only cloud, there are options. If you must use on-prem, well, Kubernetes might be a good choice, maybe the best, maybe the only one if you want to use something like hybrid. What if you have hundreds of thousands of tenants? Well, there are not so many options which you can use, and then Kubernetes again could be a really good solution. So yeah, think about that. And as John said, it would be like long-term choice. Now how your app looks like. So yeah, and here, John, I think you're the best person to talk about this, the app architecture. So
Yeah,
what
it's
will
it's
be
always
the
a challenge.
yeah.
Yeah, it's always a challenge here because remember when we're targeting Kubernetes, we're targeting containers. This is the sort of the hosting unit, if you will, for hosting your applications within pods and scaling them up automatically within Kubernetes. And so when considering the ramifications of that, those will impose requirements on your application architecture. So a lot of people drive towards microservices. I think what you're seeing in the industry largely is a consolidation. They're moving back towards the sort of monolith. And the reasons for that go beyond just the application architecture. They go into management across source control. I want to have all my repos under one banner. It's not as hard to maintain. Migrations are a little bit easier. So app architecture goes beyond just the way that you structure your app. It's going beyond just like, okay, we're going to use these namespaces, or we're going to have these files, or they're going to have these sort of services siloed. It goes beyond just that to think about how do we structure the application itself. Are we going to have one? Or are we going to have many? Are we going to have many services that talk and intercommunicate with each other? Now, the other thing about this is that these things are going to obviously impose restrictions, and so you're going to have to make some upfront choices relative to that. But the nice thing about choosing a platform like Kubernetes is that it does think about a lot of these things, but it does, as I said before, drag you, maybe not the best metaphor, but kicking and screaming towards this sort of application architecture. And it may impose changes to your existing apps. This is an interesting requirement, that is app architecture. When you consider a move to Kubernetes, that is, you're in a brownfield environment, you have an existing application infrastructure, and you're looking to move to Kubernetes for scale. So those are going to obviously incur a cost when migrating. But if you're greenfield and you have a new application platform that you're building, these are certainly things that you need to also consider as part of your questioning.
Yeah. Migration from one platform to another is also like a separate level of pain, usually. But yeah, sometimes it's a relief. Now, what about your company? It's actually also very important, and it will be a big thing for Kubernetes implementation. So do you have many teams? Maybe you have just one? What if you have 50? Are they siloed? Do they work on independent products? And maybe each product has nothing to do with each other. Maybe it's like, I don't know, something like an independent apps. Some of them build it for customers, others for partners. Other people build it for internal use. That's way different from if they all work on one big massive application. They build just hundreds of microservices. Are they centralized? Do you actually have centralized teams? Do you have some platform ops teams? Do you have teams who will help other teams to build consistent and reliable experience? Do you have and do you want to enforce some centralized policies? Can you even do that? And finally, what's your future structure? If it's all now, how it will look like in 2 years, right? Are you going to add way more team? Are you going to acquire another company? Or maybe the other way, maybe you will be very centralized and you want to do the bigger structuring and introduce all the centralized functions and policies. So yeah, Kubernetes can be banned in multiple ways. And it's easy to make a mistake. It's easy to have like 5 teams working in the same class and one team can actually impact the other. So that's why you should consider this. Hey, how we actually can work and what we can do and what we cannot do as a company before you go and think about the platform. So yeah, I think that's about the company, and we're happy to jump into architectural choices. So what about architecture? I think the first question I hear a lot, and some complaints or difficulties I hear people face later, maybe a year or 6 months after they started Kubernetes migration, is should I actually run everything in Kubernetes? First and foremost, should I run stateful apps? I mean, don't get me wrong, they're making progress. It's a big topic. At every KubeCon, people say how much better it is. People give talks about how they run heavy database loads in Kubernetes, but
Sure.
it still might not be the easiest experience to do, right? So you still might consider some cloud native services. You still might consider some other ways to do that. There are other tools like, do you want to run Kafka in Kubernetes? Do you want to run Redis Kubernetes? And it's just, do you want to run that, I think, John, right? It's about what is easier, right? Where it makes more
Yeah,
sense to run that.
absolutely. There's a lot of workloads that back in the day I never considered, or you would think were verboten in the world of Kubernetes. And it's surprising to me people are doing these things now. So, but I think that Kubernetes is certainly it's certainly an interesting proposition for a lot of folks. They see it as the tool to solve all problems, and sometimes it's probably going to be easier for you just to maintain stuff outside of that context.
Yeah. And where we started with the company and your app high level architecture, eventually we'll come to how many clusters you use, right? So what do you have many tenants, many customers, and customers want software to run on their side? Then probably you will end up having multiple clusters. What do you have? A restaurant network. And some of these restaurants are far, far, far away from big cities. And they use software for day-to-day operations. So they just can't afford a bad network. And sometimes they might not have a good network at all, ever. So you have to think about maybe you need to install a little cluster on the side. Actually, Kubernetes can do that. There are a lot of solutions for that, right? And what if you have multiple regions? And then it gets really funny. Like, what if you have one region North America, another one is China, right? Maybe you won't find a cloud which operates in both, right? So you have to think about this multi-cloud scenarios from here. So finally, and here, John, I want to hand over to you again. So I heard that it's not always a good idea to run multiple apps in one cluster. And I know that some people have a cluster per app. Why do they do that?
Yeah, there's a variety of reasons why you'd want to go with that approach. It really depends on, the way that you structure things. But I think a lot of developers have a tendency to migrate that way because that's the way that they think about deploying. So I think it's a good question. Clusters allow you to scale, and they allow you to scale quite well with Kubernetes, but they can impose architectural challenges when it comes to development.
Yeah. And if you're interested, I can just recommend you all to see an interesting solution which recently came to the market, and now you can run Kubernetes in Kubernetes, and you can make it easier. And it looks like it's like so meta, but gives you a lot of flexibility. All right, then we touched on this a little bit, but let's dive a bit deeper. Centralized or decentralized? Do you want to have your clusters running at the edge? Can you maintain it? It has a lot of benefits, but can you maintain that? Can you distribute your configuration? Can you see the status of all these clusters? Sometimes it solves a network problem. Sometimes it solves a reliability problem, right? The impact of losing one cluster is close to nothing. Sometimes it's the other way. Sometimes it's too hard to manage and you want to run it like somewhere in your office, in your data center, in the cloud region. So think about this, consider this option. I see some customers who never thought about this in the beginning, and then they realize they would be maybe better to have 5 or 10 clusters in different locations instead of one. And yeah, that might be a good choice if you think about this in advance. And I actually saw customers who run in the cloud something like Minikube, because again, that makes sense. And they would be rather running like 50 versions of copies of that instead of like using like one big cloud native Kubernetes cluster. It makes sense. Right. Now, talking about all that, you all know that there are more than one version of Kubernetes, right? You can run Kubernetes in the cloud. There are a lot of great services. You can spin them up and put in like a couple of minutes and create as many as you want, but they might be a bit expensive. You can, I have a couple of clusters running on my laptop. So they could be as small and as easy as that. And it will be the same Kubernetes. It will work exactly like that. I use Octopus to deploy there. So absolutely same configuration. And it's amazing, especially if you want to test something. You have Redshift. Good solution to run it on-prem with support, and it makes it easier. You can go and do like vanilla cluster, if we want to call it like that, and just start from scratch, like do everything from the beginning yourself. And then with this great flexibility, you will definitely have great problems, but to extent, sometimes you need that. What else? Are there any other options I missed? Which we can
No, I think we're
be
covering
aware of?
a wide swath, but I think folks understand. Certainly, there's different types of flavors out there for sure.
Yeah. All right. Now let's go into operations. Why it's important? Because cluster maintenance, cluster bootstrapping, cluster provisioning, and all the things we talk about in a second is a big topic actually. And sometimes people don't really think about this in advance. Sometimes it's just, we have software teams. Each software team might have a cluster. They can deploy the app and they will figure it out. Sometimes it's really simple as that, but what if they don't figure out, right? What if you want to have some, what if you do care about security? What if you want to enforce some update policies? What if you, well, what if you have multiple teams working on the same cluster? And in Kubernetes, sometimes you actually can kill the whole cluster with an app, right? So I think you should ask yourself a question like, hey, do I have and who will in my company provision and maintain clusters? Who will do the monitoring function? And monitoring is a separate one because you need to monitor the cluster, but you also need to monitor the app. or multiple apps? And yeah, finally, will I have a dedicated team or teams for that? Or will I have a software team doing this? So have you ever seen the software teams doing the cluster? I saw just a couple of examples. I'm not sure if it's common.
Yeah, I think a trend that we're seeing emerging today is this notion around that underpins platform engineering. Platform engineering is a very popular term you're hearing, but the concept of following a golden path around an internal development platform, or IDP. And I think that speaks to this point here around operations, which is a lot of times teams want to be able to stand up this infrastructure and maintain it well and follow the sort of happy path or golden path to success. And I think that's where I think as an engineering team, you need to consider a lot of these things. And so operations is very near and dear to my heart, actually. I like monitoring software because I want to know when things go wrong. Where are the fires? And if you're not watching, like they do in, say, the forest, right? They have people who have lookouts. You're not going to know when things go wrong. It's the old adage, if a tree falls in this forest, is anyone here? Well, they will if they're nearby. And so you got to make sure that responsibility around clusters certainly falls in the purview around operations, and there's lots of solutions out there.
Yeah, true. And I definitely need your help with the next one. So there are so many ways to provision the clusters and bootstrap it.
Yes.
And when I
Yes.
say so many, I have a list of like 15 different tools. So
Yes.
when do they make sense? How to choose them? Should people think about this in advance?
Yeah, there's lots of ways to provision this stuff. The incumbent up here is obviously Terraform. Terraform is by HashiCorp is the way in which we can provision a lot of infrastructure in this way. But there are other solutions out there. Ansible is a very popular one from Red Hat, CloudFormation as well. And if you want to get a sense of kind of what's out there in terms of other solutions, there's any number of ways in which we can provision infrastructure, but the end state here is exactly that. We're basically trying to describe the way we want our configuration clusters to be, our Kubernetes clusters to be configured, and we'll utilize a variety of tools for that. YAML is the lingua franca for standing up a lot of this stuff, but when utilizing a technology like Terraform, for example, you use a language called HCL, or HashiCorp configuration language. Basically, the way you're standing or provisioning up all these clusters is you're describing state. So state is the end game or the end result that you want to have in terms of your clusters. And you'll use tools like this to say, please provision my environment in this manner. Now, the other thing that needs to be said is obviously Kubernetes does a lot of this state management for you. The notion of state is a very core tenant, if you will, not the Octopus Deploy, but core tenant or under a core component of Kubernetes. It's always hard when you describe these scenarios and you get your terms mixed up. Our version of a tenant versus their version of a tenant. But the notion of state is a very core one in Kubernetes, and it's something that you need to be obviously cognizant of. But the reason why you use solutions like this is it goes beyond just managing the state of Kubernetes cluster, for example. There are all sorts of different ways in which you can use these to manage state across infrastructure. But as you rightly point out, Kit, is that there's a lot of solutions out there.
Yeah, and I saw amazing examples, like some customers, they have disaster recovery plans, and they showed us like I typed just this one command, and completely new landscape from scratch with multiple clusters, all the services they need just created within minutes. And that's beautiful. And then you hear stories about, yeah, but a year ago we didn't have that, and this happened. And there was like a week of like constant 24 hours work, and we tried to resolve that. So then you really, okay, we probably should care about this auto provisioning and automation, because without that, it could just go very wrong. Another thing which people usually talk about, and maybe still not enough, is how you monitor the cluster. And there are two aspects of that. So actually three. First is how you do the actual cluster, how you know its cluster is healthy. How you collect logs, it's another one. And trust me, that can get really expensive very quickly, right? Especially if you don't think about what you're actually logging, if you have your retention policy, who can use it, and yeah, some developers can just go verbose, and then you have issues. And finally, how you actually monitor stuff you run on the cluster. because that might be same, might be different solution. Do you know your app health? Do you know if your app achieved desired state? There are solutions, so you can use, and might be wrong, but I think Prometheus is the most famous one. It's free, it's open source, you can use it. People have multiple talks about how they deploy it and how they provision it to every cluster, but there are alternatives. So, John, what do you reckon the most common commercial alternative here?
I would say Datadog is certainly up there. You mentioned this on your slide. There are a variety of other solutions out there, which link I've highlighted here. The CNCF landscape page, give it a moment to render because it does take a while, but there's a lot of solutions. In fact, monitoring and operations is its own category on that landscape. And so there's a lot of solutions out there. And it goes beyond just obviously aggregating the data itself. There's also, how do you then visualize that? Are you going to use a tool to help visualize that in a sort of a chart form? Like Grafana is a great sort of solution for doing that, because you're going to see all these messages come in at you, and they're not going to make any sense unless you actually synthesize it and then process it in a way that people can glance and go. And so I would recommend that you look at all of these things. And the nice thing is that a lot of these things are actually built in with a lot of the cloud providers. They provide turnkey solutions for part of that. And the other thing that's nice about monitoring is that you can get end-to-end monitoring in a lot of different ways. You can start with correlation IDs that start with a service request that flow through your entire system and then all the way back, and then map that as part of your observability chain. And so there's protocols out there like Open Observability and Open Telemetry, rather. Open Telemetry gives you that ability to look at the flow of how applications are communicating with each other. And so just to give folks the link there, I'll go ahead and highlight the link. This is opentelemetry.io. This is a way in which you can actually monitor these things occurring in your infrastructure. And the good news there is that a lot of the providers that Kit has listed on his slide here actually support this spec or are supporting this spec. So definitely things to consider.
Yeah, just one more thing to mention here. Think about who will have access, because yes, it's really important to link all the things together and have one place you can watch and correlate the logs and see, hey, this thing actually happened because of that. But who will need this information? Most likely your developers will need it. So think about, if they have access to these tools, which tools they're familiar with, which tools they can understand, and then if this tool will have all the information they required. Because I hear so often that, yeah, we have all these tools, but then it ends up with us doing kube CTL and going and checking it's right on the cluster. And it might be the way, but it's not the most convenient one and definitely not the most secured one. So think about, can you build it in a way you can avoid, direct debugging or intervention on the cluster level, because it's painful and it can go in a different bad direction. Another topic here, which is a hot one for operation, is how you update the clusters. Kubernetes has multiple releases per year, 3 big releases at least, and you need to think about this. Okay, you do, trust me, you do want to update your clusters, but how often do I want to do that? Do I follow just major releases or all of them? You probably need to follow some security patches. So who will actually even do that, right? Who will know when to do the update? How do you test them? Will you have some environment that you actually do the update first? How do you roll the update out? Like, do you update one cluster a day? Will you have many of them? Can you automate that? John, can you talk a little bit of backups? Because I know that you must do backup before you update, even if it's in the cloud, because things can go wrong. So, and I think
it compiles, just ship it. That's the way might as well live life on the edge, right? Well, there is an approach that people talk about, which is feature flags, which is basically ship stuff into production and then turn them off and on. And there's a variety of capabilities and providers. Again, there's just so many solutions out there. Launch Darkly is one example of this, of being able to turn these things on and off. So you can approach this problem in a different way, but updating and maintaining clusters is obviously it speaks to the fact that Octopus provides a solution to help you do that. But this is something that you need to make sure that you have part of your plans when targeting Kubernetes for sure.
And I actually saw examples and customers just say, okay, we don't update the cluster, we just kill it and create a new one because it's actually so easy,
Sure.
right? If you have all automation, which we mentioned before, well, cluster could, like not container, but the whole cluster could be like a piece of cattle, which you can just, kill and create a new one straight away.
It's easy to get into that line of thinking if you think about it, because Kubernetes does drive you towards that sort of style of thinking with the concept of a deployment in Kubernetes. This is the fact that I have a replica set defined. It's like, give me 3 of these pods, and if one goes down, just immediately update it, for example. So I can understand people thinking in that way. I would think in that way, for example. If it just goes down, instantiate a new one.
Yep, makes sense. Now the configuration. So you probably all know that configuration for Kubernetes could be done imperatively, but the best and recommended way is to do it in declarative manner, right? Describe it as a piece of YAML, and well, it has a lot of advantages. I don't even want to touch on that. I think they're quite obvious. But there are questions about this because, well, if there were no questions, things like customize a Helm, they wouldn't exist, right? But they do. Why is that? The thing is, most likely, unless you're really unique, each app require multiple resources, right? You need config my apps, you need, well, deployments, you need services, you need something else, you need secrets. Probably you will deploy more than one app. You will have some op apps like monitoring, you will have your actual app, you maybe have some app for your like internal customers, external. So you have to do many of these things. And something tells me from experience that some of your apps, especially if you use microservices or similar architecture, will have similar configurations, right? And again, most likely, you will deploy these apps to multiple environments and tenants. So the question here is, do you want to manage 50, 60, 70 different YAML files and manually update them? The answer is probably no, right? And that's where we actually go into the weeds about configuration. And I might be wrong here, but every time I hear people talking about configuration, I think they're actually talking about templates, John. What do you think of it? How can I reuse stuff, right?
Yes. YAML is it's fine. It's a textual-based format. It's easy to grok, relatively speaking. Indentation can be a challenge, but when people consider these things, then obviously the notion of templating comes into effect. And the problem with that is that these configuration files can get rather large. And so you want to expose that out through different means. But there are solutions out there, which we'll talk about in a second, that you can leverage. I just want to do a timeout here for a second and highlight a question because this is live. We want to make sure that we're answering your questions. So Tino asks here, I'm developing a system as a solo developer with experience using Octopus with Kubernetes. If the client doesn't have cluster support staff / skills, do you think it's worthwhile using Kubernetes, or I may as well use traditional app hosting? This is a great question, and this is something that you need to consider. And this is kind of all the questions that we're talking about here relative to Kubernetes. As a solo developer, building out a solution for a client or customer who doesn't have the ability to manage this, I would immediately start thinking about just using traditional web app hosting, for example. You don't want to see Kubernetes as a solution to everything because you're going to impose requirements, limitations. It's going to obviously drag you towards a different style of development. However, I would look at it more, if you were to consider Kubernetes, I would look at it as an ability to grow in the future. So as I said before, brownfield is retrofitting something. It's like when you renovate your house, right? Well, I wish we had done it this way when we built the house, because it would be so much easier. You can approach software the same way. I would say that it really depends. And I know it sounds like a cop-out. Answers of it depends aren't always the great answers, but yeah, it's definitely something that you'll have to consider in terms of future direction of your application.
I think from what I
Mark, this is answered.
Answering this question a little bit more, like if you have one app It's simple. Maybe you have one or two containers, and it can run from a cloud. I think it's really hard to justify Kubernetes here. But I saw examples like food trucks, where you have no connection, and then you need to run the app locally, and you have choice like I run Docker, I run something like Minikube. In this case, Kubernetes actually makes sense because it's easy to configure. You can just distribute these YAML files across all of this laptops or um, local hardware you use. So yeah, I think this is also important. What your client is, where they will run it. Like, is it a big app?
Another question here is from Raghunath, who asks or says, I'm eager to know when you are likely to launch the Argo CD with Octopus Agent. We can just quickly answer this one, which is basically Kit and I have been talking about this integration with Argo CD. Did you want to just highlight, or did you want to provide an update as to the status of that?
Yes. So I can tell you that right now the whole team is working on improving the GitOps story with Octopus. I can't tell you. I mean, I can promise you one thing. Within the next couple of weeks, we'll start putting some stuff in our public
Ooh,
roadmap,
there you go.
and there will
I
be
like it.
just there will be just small steps towards the bigger goal. So we didn't abandon that. We think about this. So yeah, what I would really want to, what I'm really doing now, and please, 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 just if you, I can go back to the slide with my Calendly invite. But we're really looking forward to talk to as much customers as we can who actually would like us to build integration with Argo CD because we want to know more, like what exactly are you doing, how we would use it, why do you want to build it, etc. So this is enormously helpful because not no scenarios scenarios are unique, right? So please, if you do need that, the best way to speed it up is give us like 30 minutes at a time. We will highly appreciate that. Thank you.
There you go. And if you have any other questions, folks, let us know in the Q&A. We're happy to stop and answer them as we go through. All right. Sorry, Kit. I interrupted your flow. My apologies.
No worries at all. So we are talking about configuration templates. And yes, the whole thing is, in many cases, you want to organize your files and your resources in some way. You want to do adjustments. That's all about reusing this multiple times, right? So I have 3 environments and I don't want to have multiple replicas in the test maybe, but in production I do, right? I want to limit my resources consumption in test, but I need more resources in production. These adjustments should happen on the go. You don't want to mainly maintain 3 versions of the same file. You want to reuse them. What if you have 50 apps? What if all of these 50 apps are just microservices and they basically just need different labels, maybe different ports, maybe obviously they need different container images, but nothing else? Do you really want to have 50 different versions of the file? Is there a way to do it better? Trust me, there are. And finally, observe. Not observing the app here, but observing the configuration. What is actually going to be deployed? Do I understand that? If it's like a big pile of files which I'm completely lost in, or is there a better way? So at some point you start thinking about, especially if you use Octopus, you start thinking about variables. So can I just do all that with variables? And the question is, it's a good question, and the answer is yes, you can. So Octopus and other tools provide you great flexibility with variables, and it's easy to observe, it's easy to reuse, it's easy to maintain. It's all great. And at some point in the beginning, it's probably the best solution you can have, right? It's if you're happy to trust deployment tool, start with variables. But let's talk about what is beyond variables and when you might need it. So sometimes you need just more power. And let me give you an example like this. For example, you might have 100 microservices and they might be like 3 groups of them. So let's say you have your public facing web apps, you have your customer or partner APIs, and maybe you have some stateful apps. And there will be still a lot of similarities, but many things will be different. So what if you want to change the whole blocks of YAML or add or exclude resources from this? This is like, we're talking about like 3 level transformation here. So first, I want to use some template configuration and adjust it for the need of the particular app type. Then I need to take this and adjust this to the need of a particular app, like adding labels, containing images, other things. And then this configuration should be adjusted for environments and tenants need. So we have like 3 levels of transformation. And at this point, variables might not be enough, so you need to combine it with something. And there are multiple ways, multiple tools to use. So I will mention Customize the Helm, but there are many others, and we'll briefly talk about that in the end. So what you should consider when you use this. From my experience, your consideration should be how flexible I want to go. These tools provide you different levels of flexibility. But flexibility goes with complexity. So how flexible I want to do. Where it's not just about if I use Helm or Customize, or for example, which part of the customization I dedicate to Customize the Helm, which part I do in variables, right? The second thing is, will I ever need valid YAML? That's actually a big question from customers, and that's something people usually don't think about in advance, and then they struggle. So if your configuration has variables all over the place, you kind of will never be able to deploy it outside of the deployment tool, but that might be the need for your developers to test it locally, for you to distribute it across your clients, for many other reasons. Will you allow? Do you need to think about scenario, then you have valid YAML, and then you modify it? For example, Customize can give you a great way of doing this. Do you have expertise? Do your company know Customize or Helm, or maybe none? And then variable, it's also common, then variables might be the only best way. How easy it is to maintain all that, right? So will we be able to evolve that over the next year or two? Do you know how to do that? So yeah, it's a big topic. And John, feel free to add something. Or I
Nope,
can just jump
great.
Cool. So final thoughts about how to choose that. Again, commonly we see a lot of people, especially if it's a small app, starting with plain YAML and variables, and it's easy to start. You just have a couple of resources defined. You add variables to change like container names, CPU, RAM, replicas, and it works absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just hard to scale for multiple apps. That's it. And again, with variables, it gives you a lot of power. Then you go to Helm. Let's say you have, and Helm, in my opinion, it's amazing if you want to distribute your software. We distribute software with Helm, right? So you can install Octopus with a Helm chart. And a lot of companies do that. And that's all because charts could be versioned. Helm provides you a lot of extra features when you do installation. Like, for example, you can use Atomic and you can verify that the app is actually running as you intended. And Helm has enormously great community, good documentation. I think it's one of the best. I just can't think about anything which would be better documented with so many examples. So Helm is good, but at some point, especially if you use a lot of children and parent charts and you want to do a real powerful templating engine, I think it gets really complex. It's really hard to debug. However, then it goes in Customize, and you're like, not so new anymore. New kid on the block, no, not so new, but still newer than Helm, which has a lot of features, and it looks like it was meant to do the templating stuff. There are a lot of things like you can just alternate the label, alternate the image, so it gives you all this power, and it's really easy to debug, and it's in kubectl. But I think the community is still growing, so you might struggle in the beginning. The adoption of Customize might be a bit harder. And if you're using Helm already, the migration would be hard as well. So think about this and think about how you can combine all that together, right? I would recommend combining Helm and Customize, although you can do that, but I would recommend combining this in variables, and that's a powerful mix. I just pause here because it's a big one. So, John, do you have any questions on that, or do you want to add something?
No, just a time check on everyone. We're at 47 minutes past the hour. It's gone really quick, but yeah, just letting folks know that if you have any questions, feel free to submit them to the Q&A pane.
Awesome. And yeah, just one thing to mention, there are alternatives. So you can write in-house scripts, and I saw that. It could be really tricky, really messy, but it could work. Then you just alternate the configuration with some Python scripts. You can use JSONNet, even more powerful, but even more complex, and you can use other tools. So there are ways to do that. Right. Finally, before you choose, it's our topic. Before you choose the deployment tool, because eventually you need to deploy to Kubernetes, right? What's the point of running all these classes if you don't do deployments, right? So here, again, could be really messy. So what I would think about in the beginning is who will create pipelines? Do I want my developers to create pipelines? Do I want to create pipelines for them? Is it somewhere in the middle, right? How to maintain all that? What if I need to change just little thing, but in 50 pipelines or 300 or 500? How can I do that in the future? How can I provision pipelines? And do I need templates? And here I want to hand over to John because I know he loves pipeline provisioning topic.
Yeah, pipeline provisioning is something that's near and dear to my heart. We think about it a lot. I've been on development teams where we've had to think very strategically about how we go about who kicks things off. How does, this is sort of which came first, the chicken or the egg. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which you can utilize pipelines effectively, and you have to think about those things very carefully. We utilize GitHub and GitHub Actions quite a bit for our own development, but these pipelines can live in a variety of ways, and so there's lots of strategies to consider there. Moving along quickly, obviously this speaks to our model. So when we talk about deployments a lot, we think a lot about the way in which we model deployments, and that's where Octopus comes involved. So I think that's something we're just about to talk about here.
Yes. So deployment modeling is very important. You might think about this as, it's easy. I just have a couple of environments. I just use feature branches or something like this. It's never that easy, especially long term. So think about how you want to wrap it. Think about if you want tenants. We mentioned before that you might have regions, you might have clients, tenants might do other things. So if you need that, how you will model this, how many environments you need. Should these environments be should have different life cycles, etc. So just think about this in advance because it might be harder to change later, right? So it might be too easy to ignore in the beginning. Another quick one is who will actually deploy and debug stuff. So do you want your developers to do that? It's a great idea, but you need to give them tools. You need to give them visibility, as we mentioned before. They should be able to do the debugging. Do you want some extra control? Will your tool allow you to do this control? Will your tool allow you to integrate with some third-party services or just add some scripts to do some checks to verify the deploying, to do maybe some smoke tests before you promote? So think about what are the limitations and rules about the promotion and if your tool can do that for you. Another one is where you store images, because it's important, right? You store the image and then it should be available for a cluster. So, and also your tool, it should be available for a tool if you want to consume, for example, the tag version and just add it to your configuration. So if you use multiple clouds, where will you store it? If you use on-prem, where will you store it? So I think it's really important. And it's, again, something which is easy to miss in the beginning, and it will catch you later, for sure. And similar thing here is how you manage secrets, right? There are multiple ways. Please don't store them in YAML files in Git. Please don't do that because we know people do. I mean, we talk about this every time and then someone definitely does that, so it happens. But you can do that if you use something like sealed secrets. It's not scalable, a bit not easy to manage long term, but you can choose this way. Or you can choose external vault. And again, then you have to choose about if I want to use my CD tool as a kind of a vault. We do it in Octopus. Does it make sense for me to do it in a cloud? Because cloud providers have these options. And if I want to use some third party like HashiCorp, for example. Anything to add here, John?
No, I think you've covered it great.
Good. And finally, if you don't mind talking a little bit about, I think just you're the best person to do that. Like, what are the boundaries? Do you need to think about boundaries between your platform and software teams, and what could happen if you don't think about it?
Yeah, really quickly, there's lots of solutions out here, and how you control basically and how you maintain this. I think that you should look at Open Policy Agent as one option here relative to that. There's lots of ways in which you can control and enforce those policies. So I'll include a link to Open Policy Agents and Open Policy Agent in the chat.
Yeah, it's a really good one. So yeah, and just to finish this long conversation, what about Octopus? So Octopus is a deployment tool, and we do deployments well. We don't aim to do everything we mentioned. So it's not just you need Octopus and it will do everything for Kubernetes. Unfortunately, it won't, but it will do some things. So for example, Octopus can help you with cluster bootstrapping, creation, updating. You can do this all from one tool, and that actually helps because you will have also history and you see like how it goes across multiple clusters. Kubernetes is, as we mentioned, especially painful when you think about templating and configuration. Octopus can solve that. So we can use customized Helm, we can use a plain YAML, and we can combine it all with variables and check it out. You can build very complex but powerful system here. We have great modeling for environments and tenants, combining with configurations that can remove a lot of headache. And we have observability. So now you can check if your cluster is actually running as expected after deployment. So Octopus will wait till the cluster reaches desired state before moving on. And if not, then you'll see this as an error. So you can act on this straight away. And finally, but probably very important, Octopus can give you granular control. So you can say, hey, my developers can do this, my QA people can do that, and my ops can do this, and they don't step on each other's toes, and they feel safe because there is nothing worse than just having root access without understanding what you're doing and being afraid of clicking a button. So you can solve it here, and you can have great audit so you know who did what when, and it's also good for your maybe security audit companies who want to give you some nice certificates about it. So yeah, we'll talk about it later. We have a couple more webinars scheduled for next month and another one in November. We'll talk about these topics in greater detail. So yeah, I won't stop on this any further. And I think that's it. The last thing I want to ask you, please share your stories with us. Help us to make better Octopus. Help us to learn more about how people do Kubernetes. Don't hesitate to share some, even silly stories, because it's always good learning. And yeah, hope you enjoy Kubernetes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kit. I'm looking forward to the next webinar, actually. I think that there's lots of stuff to take in. Obviously, I'm sensitive to the fact that we are at a time constraint here. So I'll just mention a few links and we'll get to the Q&A. So earlier, Kit mentioned the fact that we're looking for feedback. One way in which you can share your feedback is through the roadmap. The link I've highlighted at the bottom there is roadmap.octopus.com. This should be at least a bookmark in your browser. So let us know what feedback you have. You have the ability to submit your ideas there if you so choose, and go ahead and check that out. Otherwise, you can reach out to Kit. He's given all his contact info here. Send him your feedback around Kubernetes in particular. Kit is very keenly interested in finding out more about that. We have a couple of questions here. We're going to go ahead and highlight. Again, another question from Raghunath. Is it challenging to use tenants in deployments when opting for untenanted deployments? So the idea here is that I don't have my application broken up across silos for different geos or for potentially different customers, etc. I don't have this notion of tenants. Why is it challenging to use tenants in deployments when opting for untenanted deployments? I guess the idea there is that it's going to take you to, much like Kubernetes, it imposes a sort of architectural design choice up front. So tenanted deployments does that same notion. And one of the things that we're doing right now, if you go to our blog, which is at octopus.com/blog, I'll go ahead and include the link here. There is an article series written by Andy, a member of our team, talking a lot about the notions of why this is important. What does a world look like without tenants and tenanted deployments, and how challenging can it be? And so you can read up a little bit more about that rather than kind of spending a lot of time here talking about answering that question. Another question we have here is from Sean, who asks, my current dev team uses Bitbucket, Bamboo, Octopus for our release process. We have multiple tenants using Octopus. We have recently acquired a company that uses ADO and Kubernetes, considering consolidation into ADO, Kubernetes, Octopus question mark. Is that practical? Kit, did you have any feedback or thoughts about this?
Right, that's a good one. So honestly, I can't remember an example where we face ADO with like any recent example of the customers. So
We should probably clarify ADO. I'm assuming we all agree that ADO means Azure DevOps.
I think so. Yeah, that's my
Okay.
assumption.
This is the thing about acronyms, is that they can mean any different number of things. So Azure DevOps is what I'm assuming.
Yeah, I would say that in general, consolidation is the good thing and bad thing. So good thing, if you use something like Octopus, if you use a CD tool, you can live with multiple CI tools. And I would start maybe just think about what if you have your CI, because CI is complicated. CI is long build, right? Take long time to build. So what if you start with having maybe multiple ways to build a container and test a container, but then one thing to deploy, because then you will have visibility over all the clusters, all the tenants, all the environments. So start here, check it out if it works, and think about what's your next step. Because to be honest, Azure DevOps is, well, you know that like it might be replaced in the future with GitHub Actions. I would say that it's possible. I think it's going there. So think about which of these tools you want to work with long term, works better for you. Are you going to move somewhere else? And then then you can consider like also changing your CI. But in general, I think the power of Octopus and power of this isolated CD tool that it can work with, as it works with multiple platforms and targets, it also works with multiple CI tools. So starting here, consolidation CD will be a good first step.
Yeah, we support Azure DevOps quite well, actually. We rev our integration there quite a bit. So if you want to kick off deployment processes, push packages, etc., you can do all of that within Azure Pipelines, which is the official kind of CI name, I guess. Azure DevOps gives you a whole host of other stuff as well. I would say that the bigger concern for me is the jump to Kubernetes in particular, because that's implied in your question there. But in terms of CI, we support them all almost. So, and we have a CLI and we have an API. And so at the end of the day, I don't think we're pretty agnostic when it comes to CI. We just like, look, we're just waiting for you to send us a package and tell us what to do, basically, is what we're trying to say. And so we're moving from left to right relative to that.
One quick thing on that, consolidation is definitely a meaningful thing, because if you don't want to have two tools, two separate paths to deploy stuff to your clusters, that's just asking for trouble. So yeah, if you have one way to do that, that's safer.
Awesome. We are at the top of the hour. I'd like to thank Kit for his presentation. Don't forget, you can go to octopus.com/webinars for any future webinars that are coming up. Much appreciated. And with that, I would like to wish everyone a great morning, afternoon, evening, whatever. We'll see you on the next one. Take care, everyone.